This DNA acts as a kind of genetic stamp, a temporal marker that indicates that, before going to other destinations, the ancestors of these populations had to pass through areas inhabited by Neanderthals. It is like a signature that could only have been acquired in a specific prehistory interval. And that's where the narrative begins to change. Australian Aboriginal peoples, like all non-African populations, carry this Neanderthal genetic mark. This means that your ancestors could only have arrived in Sahul after this mixture, not before. Simply put, if the intersection occurred between 50 and 53,000 years ago, it would not be possible that they were in Australia 65,000 years ago, unless there were previous populations without this genetic inheritance, which then disappeared without leaving descendants. This discovery opened a deep impasse between two ways of seeing the past: the physical archaeological evidence, visible in stone and pigment, against the invisible but powerful record inscribed in the human genetic code itself. And this tension is the exact point where our dive in Block 2 will continue, exploring how these two lines of evidence collide, complement each other, and can perhaps reveal a much more complex story than we imagined. If for geneticists, the presence of Neanderthal DNA is an unquestionable temporal marker, for many archaeologists, this view is, at the very least, simplistic. Their argument is straightforward. DNA only tells us the story of the surviving populations and left descendants to this day. It is not able to record old migrations that have been extinguished or absorbed without transmitting their genetics to future generations. This difference in perspective makes room for an alternative hypothesis that has been gaining strength. Perhaps the Majid baby site represents a much older, previous colonization that did not genetically contribute to current populations. In other words, there may have been a pioneering group that arrived in Sahul 65,000 years ago, but which, by environmental factors, competition or assimilation, eventually disappeared, being replaced by later migratory waves that already carried Neanderthal DNA. This theory of multiple migratory waves has parallels in other parts of the world. In Europe, for example, archaeological and genetic evidence show that modern populations have replaced anterior human groups at various times, often without leaving almost any genetic trait of them. In North America, recent studies suggest that the first human presence may have been even older than Clovis cultures, but without genetic continuity in modern indigenous populations. To support this vision, some researchers point to discoveries such as the rock paintings found on Sulawesi Island in Indonesia. This island is halfway between continental Asia and Australia and holds one of the oldest art collections ever dated outside Africa. In isolated caves, negatives of human hands and animal representations have been identified, an estimated minimum age of 51,200 years, and some experts believe that certain layers of pigment may be even older. The important detail is that Sulawesi is at a relatively short distance from Sahul. If humans were already producing art there during this period, this means that the sea routes for the Australian supercontinent could be active long before the date defended by geneticists. In addition, rock art is a powerful cultural marker. It suggests that these groups were not simple isolated hunters-lectors, but communities with language, symbols, and traditions transmitted from generation to generation. However, geneticists respond that geographical proximity is not proof of arrival. The fact that a group lived near Sahul does not mean that it has effectively crossed there. Moreover, even if you have crossed, this does not guarantee that you have survived enough to leave descendants. In the midst of this battle of evidence, another element of discussion arises: the very accuracy of dating methods. Although OSL is extremely useful for dating old sediments, it depends on certain ideal conditions. Sand layers can be disturbed, accumulated energy in grains can be partially released by underground heat or natural events, and the transport of sediment by water or wind can confuse reading. On the other hand, genetic models also have their limitations. They are based on mutation rate estimates and population sizes that, although increasingly sophisticated, still carry significant margins of error. For decades, a single number served as an anchor for one of humanity's most fascinating stories: 65,000 years. This was the date that, according to the consensus of many archaeologists, marked the arrival of the first human beings to the territory we know today as Australia. More than a temporal landmark, it was a symbol that one of the oldest and most continuous cultures on the planet, supported by archaeological evidence, which at the time seemed unquestionable. But in science, no truth remains forever. Recent discoveries based not on stones or pigments, but in ancient DNA, are launching deep doubts about this schedule. And if they are correct, these new proofs can completely rewrite the initial chapter of Sahul's human occupation, the supercontinent that united Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania during the last era of ice. To understand the impact of this possible turnaround, we need to go back in time, long before there are the coastal lines we know today. Thousands of years ago, sea level was so low that vast extensions of Earth now separated by oceans formed a single continental mass. This territory, called by Sahul scientists, was almost the size of modern Europe and covered an impressive diversity of ecosystems: deserts, tropical forests, mountain ranges, and extensive coastal plains. Arriving in Sahul was not a simple task. It was not enough to follow land as in other prehistory migratory routes. It was necessary to cross open oceans, sailing over islands that today make up the Indonesian archipelago in a risky route, subject to treacherous chains, storms, and long earthless stretches. This journey required not only courage, but also notable nautical and cognitive skills for the time, mastery of vessel construction, tidal knowledge, and possibly star navigation techniques. The traditional model, defended until recently, suggests that the first groups departed from Southeast continental Asia through regions now known as Timor, Flores, or Semu, until reaching the back of the northern Sahul. The big question has always been, when exactly did this crossing happen? The response that dominated the last decades came in 2017, when an archaeological study at the Majed Babe site in the Australian Northern Territory won the world's headlines. There, a team found an impressive set of human artifacts, sophisticated stone tools, ochre fragments possibly used for body art or rupestra, burnt remains of plants and bones that suggested a continuous occupation pattern. To date the finding, the researchers resorted to a state of the art technique known as optically stimulated luminescence, OSL. OSL works ingeniously. Quartz or feldspar grains present in the sand accumulate over time, energy from the natural radiation of the soil. When these grains are exposed to sunlight, the memory of accumulated energy is zeroed. By burying the grains again, they begin to register the time from the last contact with the light. In the laboratory, scientists can release this accumulated energy, measuring the brightness emitted and thus estimating how long that sediment was covered. In the case of Majid Bebe, grains associated with human artifacts indicated an age of about 65,000 years. This date was revolutionary. It meant that modern humans arrived in Sahul long before the colonization of other regions, such as the Americas, and even before the final expansion through North Asia. More than that, I implied that they already had, tens of thousands of years, technology and organization comparable to what was seen in other parts of the world just a long time later. However, as is common in science, the grandeur of this statement attracted criticism. Sedimentology specialists warned of a phenomenon known as post-depositional vertical movement. In sandy soils, artifacts can move to deeper layers over time due to natural activities such as root action, water infiltration, or even earthquakes. This could make newer objects look much older. Even with these criticisms, Majid Bebe continued to be defended by his discoverers as a robust proof. They claimed to have used multiple methods of control and stratigraphic analysis to minimize the risk of error. The debate seemed stabilized, until the scene came to the scene what many call the testimony of the blood, the DNA. From the 2010s, it says, advances in paleogenetics allowed scientists to extract and sequence the DNA of human remains and even extinct species, such as Neanderthals. This revolution revealed a surprising fact. All modern humans living outside Africa carry about 2% of Neanderthal DNA. That it is the result of meetings and intersections that occurred at some point between 50,000 and 53,000 years ago, probably in regions of Western and Central Eurasia. This reality leads some scientists to propose that it is not choose between the stone and the gene, but of integrating them. A more complex and complete narrative could recognize that there was an initial settlement of Sahul about 65,000 years ago, but that the main wave of colonization, which genetically shaped modern Aboriginal populations, occurred thousands of years later, between 50 and 45,000 years ago. If this hypothesis is correct, the history of the early Australians is no longer a straight line and becomes an intricate web of arrivals, departures, substitutions, and cultural mergers. Perhaps the first group came when the weather was favorable, explored the territory for centuries, but succumbed to a sudden environmental change, a catastrophic event, or the pressures from new migrant groups. Perhaps there has been coexistence and cultural exchange between the different waves, but for reasons still unknown, only the last one has genetically perpetuated. Meanwhile, new discoveries continue to emerge. In coastal caves of the Australian Northwest, archaeologists have found stone tools that, according to the first analyses, can be up to 50,000 years. In submerged regions of the continental shelf, areas that were land during the last glaciation, sonar and divers began to identify structures that may have been old human occupations, now hidden under dozens of meters of water. If these areas are successfully exploited, they may provide decisive evidence to push Sahul's occupation date to the past. At the same time, genetic sequencing technology continues to advance. Today, it is already possible to extract fragments of DNA to sediment where there are no visible bones left. This means that in the near future, it will be feasible to rebuild parts of the genetic history of populations that lived and disappeared for tens of thousands of years. If such samples are found in sites such as Majid Baby, it will be possible to check if they really did not carry the Neanderthal DNA, which would be a direct proof that there was a migration prior to the main genetic wave. Faced with so many possibilities, the feeling is that we are just scratching the surface of a much deeper and more complex story. The debate between archaeology and genetics is not only technical. He also talks about how we build the collective memory of humanity. Which narrative to choose? What is resting on silent stones that resist the time, or based on the invisible codes we carry within each cell? While this question is not resolved, one truth remains. Australian Aboriginal peoples continue to be heirs to one of the oldest cultures in continuity on the planet. Its oral stories, songs, and rituals carry echoes of a past that in many ways still challenges science. And now, the question is to you. Given these new proof of DNA and archaeological finds, which scenario seems most convincing to you? The most recent arrival, backed by the precise genetic clock, or the much older occupation, supported by impressive physical discoveries? Leave your opinion in the comments. Each perspective counts and can add new pieces to this millennial puzzle. After all, the story of Sahul's early inhabitants is still being written, and the next chapter may arise at any moment under the sand, on the walls of a cave, or even the microscopic interior of a human cell.